Hollow Knight is an extraordinary game. It's one of those rare titles you can play to completion and still struggle to point out even the most minor of flaws. It's one of the most solid, well-rounded experiences I've ever had playing a game, and I want to get to the bottom of why that was. So I figured I could do something useful with my 90 hours of experience and elucidate why this masterpiece is so special to so many people. And how even after my hundreds, or maybe thousands of deaths in this game, I still find myself getting up from that bench wanting more. Please God release Silksong. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania, and much like I could with the base roots of that portmanteau, I'm going to subdivide this game's constituent atoms into two distinct categories: journey and combat. It's within these two words that we'll find our answers to what makes Hollow Knight tick, and hopefully why I can't stop thinking about it even years later and after a fourth playthrough. So as a ploy to not take any more time than is needed, let's dive straight into the journey. Movement is hands down the most important part of any game. That's right, even puzzle games aren't immune to my thinly veiled schmovement bias. And the movement in Hollow Knight is so damn crispy. A great world means nothing without the ability to effectively navigate it. The controls are incredibly responsive, which is a nice bonus, considering you're only going to have to deal with them for the entire game. Jump height is variable depending on how long you hold the button down for, which allows for so much self-expression in how you move. Being a Metroidvania, some movement abilities are locked behind upgrades found throughout the world of Hallownest. Of course, we have the usual suspects here, a wall jump, a double jump, but the ability that really stands head and shoulders above the rest is dash. This is the main contributing factor to how clean Hollow Knight's movement is. Being able to dash grounded, midair, and off walls adds so much depth to how you move. It's excellent both in and out of combat. Dash allows for quick repositioning around enemies, while still being committal enough to where it's punishable. Failed champ will eat you alive for errantly dashing back. It also provides a button to spam during exploration for mashers like myself. Combine all this with being able to seamlessly transition into and out of dash from basically your entire toolkit, and you get an incredibly responsive movement system. It's one thing for a system like this to work for exploration, it's another thing entirely to make those same rules work in combat. And the ultimate task is to make both of those things true simultaneously, while also having it be fun. Especially with Dashmaster, that charm is so necessary to my muscle memory that it's farther left on my charm build than the friggin' Void Heart. Everything I've just said about dash can basically be repeated for wall jump, just on the vertical axis instead of the horizontal. This is inherently less flashy than dash due to the fact that floor, you know, the thing you walk on, is horizontal, and thus allows for much more common usage of dash. As for double jump, there's an abundance of quality of life features which bolster its ease of use, the most important being that if you touch the floor just as your double jump starts, you get one back. Even if the wings animation and sound play out, so you're never caught midair wondering why you're plummeting into a pit of spikes. Well, not as frequently anyway. Another massive factor towards Hollow Knight's godlike movement is nail pushback. Whenever you hit an enemy, there's always that instantaneous kinetic feedback from the knockback the nail deals. For small enemies, both the knight and the enemy will feel this force, while larger enemies won't budge at all. What's important here is that this feels intuitively correct, while providing so much depth to the game's combat. You can swing forwards and experience pushback, or swing upwards and not take pushback at all, as the force of the swing is counteracted by the ground you're standing on. This system even allows for something as fundamental as pogoing. In fact, pogoing warrants a little more of a deep dive, as it's the main way you can sequence break the game. But the astounding fact is, it almost feels like Hollow Knight is ready for you to find some of these skips, even expecting you to. I was intuitively able to find the Hornet 2 fight on my first playthrough way before getting wings, and because of how Hollow Knight operates, the only thing holding me back from winning that fight was my severe case of skill issue. It's not like I sequence broke into an impossible area, far from it. I'm even tempted to say Hornet 2 is intentionally made to be one of, if not the easiest refights in the game, solely to account for players potentially encountering her early. Even looking past that, there's a suspicious amount of rooms where double jump is required, which house conveniently placed background props, or flying enemies, both of which you can pogo. I think this says a lot about how much thought went into Hollow Knight's area and level design, which is obviously excellent mechanically, but shares the same level of excellence atmospherically. I will never forget the first time I entered City of Tears. The door behind me locked, the only way to go was forward. With the enchanting music slowly fading in and the dripping of rain getting ever louder, I reach a bench occupied by this mysterious wanderer, And it's as I share this bench, a universal sign of hospitality in this strange world, and the camera pans slightly to the right, allowing me to soak in the stunning visuals of this grand underground structure somehow being bathed in simulated rainwater, that I realized this game was special. The city is seriously a mesmerizing location to take in. There's a serene, peaceful aura about the place, and there's clearly a lot of history behind it. From the somewhat ominous lore tablets to the gigantic statue of the Hollow Knight in the central plaza, you begin to wonder what could have gone wrong to leave such a bastion of serenity so thoroughly devoid of life. Deep Nest is the other location I will never forget my first trip down to. It's an aggressive, hostile area, even Cornifer is terrified of the place, and he's chill in literally every other area of the game. Between the spine-chilling sound design, the unnerving music, and the self-resurrecting spider corpses, Deep Nest practically screams that you are not welcome. Seriously though, even the intangible camera is not safe from the webs, shadows, and spiders that dart around in the foreground. This place breaks and malignantly twists your expectations as to how games even function in order to achieve maximum spook factor. And of course, there's the bench. I know everyone talks about it already, but there's a good reason for that. It's because it really is that sublime a moment. In the room before the bench, you see some semblance of structure and begin letting that insidious thought into your head. Maybe there is a safe haven down here. So when I did reach that bench, after such an arduous journey without so much as a lantern to keep me company, I sat down without a second thought. Didn't even give the NPCs the time of day, though had I, they do make it quite obvious. I described benches as a universal sign of hospitality earlier, and I really did think that, but that illusion being shattered will forever haunt my memory. The last area I think deserves attention is the place where the knight's journey begins. Forgotten Crossroads is very true to its name. It's quite forgettable. Other than that one downright inspirational moment where hitting a Georock opens a secret wall, Crossroads is a glorified tutorial area. That is, until the infection spreads. This is such a cool, unique concept, tying both story and gameplay together, to showcase the power of the infection. At the point in the game where you trigger this by killing a Dreamer, Forgotten Crossroads will be a cakewalk, hardly worth the time of day to navigate. So spicing the area up by introducing new enemies gives the player a reason to revisit with all their new equipment. This transformation also serves as the game calling you out for your actions in its world. You're the one whose meddling caused the infection to spread. The only issue I have with Infected Crossroads is that it also introduces some impassable obstacles, which used to allow the player much freer movement through the crossroads, which seems antithetical to one of the core principles in a Metroidvania. Progression usually means gaining abilities, which make map traversal easier and quicker, so the opposite happening is pretty unfortunate. I wish you could just use a spell to open a temporary path through the infection. On the topic of traversal, I think it's handled quite well in Hollow Nest. You have two main sources of fast travel, those being stag stations and Dashmaster. Oh, yeah, and trams, I guess? Starting with stag stations, these are definitely the most versatile form of fast travel. There's 11 of them scattered throughout the world, and they're usually placed in pretty strategic positions to capture the majority market share of the one bug left in the world who uses these things. Seriously, you can leave the stag at any station, faff around for a bit, and he'll be waiting at the exact same station for you to come back. And he's lucky for my customer support too. You can even hear him not so translucently trash talk the tram system. The tramway isn't as useful as the stagway, but it is a nice reward for, you know, going into Deep Nest and making it back out alive. At least it has nice, relaxing, sideways elevator music. I am really glad the fast travel isn't just navigate to the room you want to go to on the map though, because that'd shatter my immersion almost as fast as if Gerb looked in a mirror. You know who's a funny little guy? Zote, that's who. The way you constantly find him in one bind or another throughout Hollow Nest, save him, and receive a verbal maelstrom of bombast for your alleged glory stealing, really makes him a character with a capital C. He should be hung up in a museum for all to witness. Heck, you could even found a pantheon around him. He's already got the precepts covered. In fact, finding the various named bugs around the world and plotting each of their journeys was a real highlight of Hollow Knight's character and world building. You have Tiso, an arrogant warrior type who wishes to challenge himself in the famed Colosseum of Fools, and succumbs to this bravado quite foolishly indeed. Quill is in a position very similar to the knight, having returned from Hollow Nest with a whole boatload of lost memories, until fate brings both parties in question to a jellyfish-infested laboratory, where, in a eureka moment befitting the teacher's apprentice, he finally remembers what the point of the mask is. Hollow Nest feels so full of life as a result of these characters each taking their own journeys through these harsh lands alongside your own. Cloth's character arc is an interesting one, with her learning to overcome her fear, only to end up on the wrong end of a mantis claw. I'm a sucker for a heroic sacrifice, and this one got me good. That's not gonna stop me from dream nailing her though. I mean, I've gotta pay for the dream gate somehow. I appreciate the ability to just mercilessly dream nail the ghost of any dead bug you come across and permanently remove them from the world. It's so damn brutal, I love it. Dreamnail in general is such a nuts tool to give to the player. It allows you to peer into other bugs' minds, non-intrusively adding so much to the game's lore, only if the player wants to hear it. And some of this dialogue is really profound and deep. The White Lady even calls you out for poking around in her thoughts uninvited, and these little blob things go, "Ooh, no, 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 no." If you dreamnailed me, all you'd hear is Cornifer humming his stupid little earworm of a tune. It's so iconic. Over the course of my playthrough, I developed an almost Pavlovian response to hearing this melody. Neat little detail about Cornifer, or rather vendors in general, is that each of their shop menus are stylized with a cute portrait of them. Lem's is my favourite, but maybe that's just because he paid me a lot of money. There are even some outstanding non-named bugs in Hallownest that I think deserve recognition. This serene moss knight staring over a huge acid lake is such a chill vibe. The mantises, being basically the only thing close to a civilization left in Hallownest, exhibit some really interesting behaviour after having bested the Mantis Lords. They're no longer aggressive towards you, instead bowing down to show their respect. This is a super unique approach to showing a tribe's culture through gameplay, and it stuck out to me as one of the best smaller bits of world building in Hollow Knight. If only the Grimchild agreed. Another really good example of this kind of unique enemy interaction is Crystal Guardian. You kinda get lulled into a false sense of security. You know, you probably shared a bench with Quirrell not long ago, and you start wondering who this new guy is until no. This bench is not big enough for the two of us, and Crystal Guardian is going to let you know. Oh, he's dead. Well, he's not the only cool thing in Peaks. I really enjoyed the Crystallized Mound sub-area. It delivers some satisfying platforming. In particular, these flipping crystal platforms provide you a compelling reason to go fast, and this concept is even honed in the Queen's Gardens when you lose the ability to pogo the spikes to flip your terrain back into a landable state. To finish off this section with anything other than the paragon of platforming would feel wrong, so it's about time we talk about the White Palace and Path of Pain. As the most difficult non-boss content you can find in the game, these two areas pull no punches in their difficulty, and they're not afraid to watch you die over and over and over again, waiting for you to finally get good. Despite the copious amounts of saws and vines, Path of Pain and White Palace do have two distinctly different identities. Seriously though, what's up with this Kingsmold's memory of the place? There's no way this is a safe working environment. Anyway, the former is a no-holds-barred test of raw movement, skill, and reaction, where there's a clear intended route through each room, and very little cheese, at least that I could find. It's reminiscent of some of the harder rooms of Celeste, although not quite as demanding. The latter takes a much more free-form approach to its room design, and I frequently did some egregious things to skip good chunks of the palace. Honestly, it felt really refreshing to have my, let's say, creativity be rewarded in the last section of White Palace, right after coming off Path of Pain. I think the main way these two areas excel is due to how they utilize pogoing and wall jumping. These are the only two ways to refresh your resources without touching the ground, and let me tell you, there's not a whole lot of ground to go around in this place. Pale King blew his budget on saw blades and had to make it work, I guess. By combining these two mechanics, White Palace and especially Path of Pain create some incredible sections where you're completely airborne for what feels like minutes at a time. The last Room of Pain stands out in my memory for including basically everything that made each screen before it so great. There's tight wall jumps, extruding spears to test your timing, fast-moving saw blades you have to track with your movement, and of course, there's the two Kingsmolds at the very end. Wait, come again? Isn't this a platforming challenge? Well, not anymore it isn't. This is honestly the only bad thing I can say about Path of Pain's design. There's no reason for there to be two incredibly unforgiving enemies, which you have minimal experience fighting against, in a cramped room where this can happen. Oh, and if you die, you have to do the whole thing over again. These two areas also greatly benefit from being in a dream, and one with benches at that. I think it's one of only two dream worlds in the whole game where you have bench access, along with Godhome. This is really nice because if you do die, and trust me, that's probably going to happen a lot, you don't feel the pressure of having to get to the same part of the gauntlet you died at just to reclaim your geo. It allows the challenge to really shine through, as without a punishment for dying, White Palace and Path of Pain can afford to be designed a lot more mercilessly. Oh, there's also this cool hidden room towards the end of White Palace with the mold used to make the Collector, and probably the Kingsmolds too. There's some interesting dream logic going on here too, as the exit spits you out in front of the entrance even though the room is a straight line. Neat. I was actually lying earlier. I do have another complaint. See this throne? I want to sit on it, but I naively collected the King's Soul piece first, thinking I had plenty of time to revel in my victory later. Instead, I preemptively wake, leaving only a hollow feeling of anger in my soul. And yes, maybe I did do the whole thing again just to sit on the chair only to realize you can't, okay, leave me alone, it was traumatizing. When talking about combat in Hollow Knight, you've got to talk about the nail. It's the most basic attack in the game, being your classic, broken, lagless, spammable, disjointed affront to the fighting game's senses, and damn is it fun to use. The nail feels incredibly responsive, and you get almost tactile feedback when actually hitting something, be that self-pushback, enemy knockback, or just the general destruction of the environment. In the context of Hollow Knight's combat, the nail provides an excellent and easy option to use, and due to there being almost no punishment for just wildly swinging, there ends up being a lot of design space opened up to include more difficult boss fights earlier on. Boiling down the combat in any game is going to lead you to two specific mantras: hit and don't get hit. The nail being so fast and large effectively makes that hit part become second nature, allowing the player to fully focus on dodging, which is where I think the game really shines. This doesn't mean there's no opportunities to find creative openings to mount an offensive, however, simply that you get to pay your full attention towards learning a boss's pattern rather than struggling to even hit it. The nail can be augmented in a few ways, including upgrades, arts, and charms. You can upgrade the nail's damage at the nailsmith in the City of Tears, the difference between the weakest and strongest nails being a little more than 4 times. When I was playing through Hollow Knight again for footage, I decided it would be a good idea to attempt to beat the game with no nail upgrades, and if you love Hollow Knight and haven't tried it, I strongly recommend. I promise you'll get a whole new perspective on some of the bosses you previously rolled over with the pure DPS of the pure nail. I never felt like I was significantly outclassed, or that I really needed to upgrade my nail, and I got to appreciate the nuances of each boss's patterns much more than before. I cannot say I have the same praise for the nail arts, however. In fact, I completely forgot I even had them for a significant portion of game time. They feel far too committal, needing you to hold the attack button to charge them up, while simultaneously only being useful in very niche scenarios. The only fight where they really felt necessary was against Markoth, and that's only because Markoth doesn't let you play the game. I think nail arts would be more usable if their charge time was brought down a bit. Charms, on the other hand, are incredibly useful. There are like a bajillion charms in the game, all of which have their own unique effect, and only one of which is Shaman Stone. Basically, there's 2 types of combat charms, ones that affect the nail, and others that affect spells or soul, and it's pretty easy to tailor your charms to suit your playstyle. I mean, I'm not in any position to seriously critique any charm builds, because I will never take Dashmaster off for any reason. Another cool thing about charms is that you can just ignore the charm notches you have, and overcharm to equip an extra one. This does make you take double damage, but it can be worth it in some niche scenarios, like when you don't have Dashmaster equipped, for example. Reminds me of Danger Mario strats from the first 2 Paper Mario games, because, you know, it's dangerous. Speaking of, the most dangerous thing in the knight's arsenal of combat abilities has to be spells. There are 3 in total: an Upward Shriek, a full-screen Fireball, and a War Crime of Invincibility. The first 2 are reasonably unreasonable. They both do a ton of damage, sometimes the Fireball can even hit twice, but the caveat is that you have to fill the soul meter in order to cast them. It takes 3 nail strikes to gather enough soul to cast, and all spells cost the same amount. Even then, you have to make a decision between using your hard-earned soul on spells to kill the enemy, or on healing yourself. So while Shriek and Fireball are both incredibly useful tools in the Knight's kit, they both have a clear opportunity cost and are only useful with the right positioning. The same cannot be said for the 3rd spell. Dive is very over-centralizing. The only weakness it has is high startup without invincibility, but basically the moment you start going down, you're invincible for like 3 whole seconds. This is kinda necessary. Like, the move's whole purpose is to attack enemies from above, so obviously it can have no invincibility or you'd always get hit, and the egregious amount of invincibility is important for consistency on larger enemies, for whom you need that time to even get out from under them. What isn't necessary is the gigantic hitbox on Dive, specifically the upgraded version, and especially with Shaman Stone. It's absolutely massive, hits above where you land, and as a result, there's almost no reason to not spam it. This is made even worse because Dive's only weakness is high startup. It promotes preemptively spamming Dive even if you're nowhere near the enemy, and the Giga hitbox will just damage them anyway. This is strange, because the unupgraded version does not have this gigantic upward hitbox, which makes it a lot less spammable, though still powerful due to the invincibility. So why does the upgraded version become so much better? The answer is simple, because this is a tool the player gets, not the enemy. There are numerous enemies with dive-analogous attacks, such as Lostkin or Soul Tyrant. but these moves have none of the things which make the Knight's dive so good. Even through its immense power, it's undeniable that dive is incredibly fun to use. Hollow Knight has some excellent bosses, and nearly all of them are designed. This section is going to be extremely large because there's so much juicy stuff to talk about, so I'm gonna have to split it up into a few smaller categories, starting with... Okay, obviously I'm not going to talk about all the bosses here, so sorry if you're a big Gruesmother fan. How interesting a boss is to fight is usually tied to its difficulty up to a certain point, with a few outstanding exceptions like the Mantis Lords. And it should go without saying, but most of Hollow Knight's bosses stand at or very near the apex of this graph. The Dream Refights are no exception, and are especially intriguing as we can compare them to their base forms to see where exactly their newfound difficulty comes from. I'm only going in depth about Soul Tyrant, Failed Champ, and Lost Kin, because, well, let's just say there's not a lot of nuance to the White Defender fight. Starting with the Soul Tyrant, a boss I actively disliked on my first playthrough, I'm glad to say fighting him with the base nail really opened my eyes up to how superb this boss really is. Because of the base nail's pitiful damage, I was basically forced to develop a deep understanding of the Tyrant's attack patterns. Due to each attempt taking quite literally upwards of 5 minutes to even make it to phase 2, it was basically impossible to not notice how much attention and care went into making sure Soul Tyrant's attacks were 100% dodgeable, even without late game abilities. I was surprised when his double dive attack was consistently dodgeable, even without wings, something I legitimately didn't think was possible before. The fact that Team Cherry made absolute certain that you can win even with an unreasonably small set of equipment is really admirable. Soul Tyrant is also one of the best bosses in terms of how you find your openings to deal damage. I went from tentatively hitting him once every few teleports to actively dashing towards him after each teleport, knowing he doesn't have an attack fast enough to punish me for doing so. I even started getting a feel for where he was going to teleport. The second phase, although easier to not get hit in than the first, also provides no healing opportunities, which really stacks on the pressure, which was an idea present in the Soul Master fight, but not capitalized on perfectly due to his relative frailty. But by making the Tyrant second phase have so much more health compared to Soul Master, the idea of it being a chaotic scramble where panic can easily take over works much better. I really felt the pressure, especially considering it takes a significant amount of time to even get back to that point. The humming light balls are a big test on your movement, and how you choose to neutralize them creates an important decision. You can either ground them, giving up a small amount of offensive pressure, or let them fly amok, confident in your ability to outmaneuver them while keeping up your damage output. Phase 2 got to a point where actually hitting the Tyrant became an afterthought. Instead, I chose to focus on learning how to dodge the projectiles, which was really hard because the first thing that starts to go when you're panicking, at least for me, is my movement. Earlier attempts where I endeavored to burst down the boss went poorly due to my god-awful damage, and it ended up taking like 5 cycles before this Tyrant's rule was finally quashed. Keep those homing light spheres in mind though. The other Dream Refights both have similar secondary threats removed directly from the boss itself. Moving on to Failed Champion, the secondary threat in this fight is the constant falling... what even are these? Meteors? Well, whatever they are, they create some nigh undodgeable situations if you get bad RNG. This is the exact opposite of Soul Tyrant, who is perfectly consistent, because sometimes you'll just get a bad meteor pattern or two and instantly lose. It doesn't help that getting hit onto your last mask darkens the borders of the screen, making these meteors even harder to react to and plan around. They also serve as a massive distraction from the Failed Champ himself, who is so ridiculously fast that anything less than your full focus will inevitably lead to your demise. Seriously, all his jumping attacks have the exact same startup animation, so you can't even tell what he's about to do until he's already flying towards you at Mach 10. Other than this meteor problem, Failed Champ is actually really good. He has very little attack variety, but that's necessary to even be able to react to what he's doing. This fight is designed to be a knife's edge balance on what can be feasibly reacted to, which is emphasized by the champ himself doing 2 masks of damage while the meteors only do 1. His AI changes pretty drastically after the first stagger, now mixing in a lot more seemingly random neutral jumps. He loses a lot of his predictability. He's not locked into doing a big jump swing after 3 shockwaves, for example. He can just neutral jump back instead. This makes the fight a lot more fun in my opinion, and it felt like I was able to react faster in Phase 2, despite him being less predictable, because I wasn't allowed to go into autopilot. I wish more of the fight was spent in Phase 2, as it's a lot more dynamic. Important to note that the champ doesn't give you soul unless he staggers, aka not a lot. Also, as I unfortunately learned the hard way, his stagger doesn't last forever, so you can't just dream nail him to get soul until you're fully healed. But the lack of soul makes for a really interesting experience when it comes to nitty-gritty nail combat. No invincible panic dives, no safe full-screen fireballs, just bare-knuckle brawling. To be honest, this might have been the hardest fight in terms of how many resets it took to beat, just due to this lack of soul. Yes, even more than that fight. Such a good boss ruined by a mechanic that just randomly puts you in quasi-undodgeable scenarios. Although, the meteors are only an issue of consistency, and I'm running base nail and no combat charms for this fight, so I was definitely disproportionately affected by this inconsistency. You can definitely also upswing to swat the meteors away from you most of the time, but this doesn't solve the issue entirely. What does solve the issue, as I found out in Godhome, is having such comically high damage that you just stagger the champ before he even exits his phase transition frenzy. Oh, and while we're here, pour one out for the poor mace bug. Little guy doesn't deserve this kind of treatment. Lostkin, while providing the smallest leap in difficulty between a refight and its normal counterpart, is also the refight that makes the best use out of its secondary threat, the infection balloons. These little bubble fellas only take one hit to kill, even with the base nail, which is a godsend for me, otherwise I'd have been completely overrun. This is specifically changed for the Lostkin fight. The bubbles which naturally spawn in Hallownest take 3 hits to kill, so thank you Team Cherry for considering my stupid challenge. The reason I think these guys are such a standout mechanic has to do with them providing an actual challenge. I probably got hit by the bubbles just as often as Lostkin himself, while also maintaining a considerable amount of counterplay. Even that counterplay asks a question which provides unique gameplay, that being, do you focus on arena management? I chose to prioritize killing the bubbles over hitting Lostkin, because when I didn't, I'd get put in the get hit blender, as the bubbles would slowly but surely funnel me into Lostkin's attacks. But I could see just focusing on bursting Lostkin down working with more damage. As for Lostkin itself, it has like 4 moves, but the fight's less about dodging these moves in a vacuum and more about how the bubbles can push you into them. The most glaring weakness these 4 moves have is that Lostkin literally has no option to hit right in front of it. The forward's lunge has a very recognizable sound cue, and the flail attack has a ton of startup, and usually clanks with the knight's swing. This makes Lostkin super exploitable. You can just walk up to it and swing, and it can't do anything in retaliation. Combine this with it staggering super easily, and you get a fight where the boss feels like less of a threat than the minions. Actually, this might even work in Lostkin's favor, as it's probably the most fun out of the bosses I've discussed so far, in part due to how easy it is to get an offensive going. It's easier to hit than Soul Tyrant, and still gives you soul unlike Failed Champ. I think it's a pretty easy fight, but this opinion comes with the caveat that this is the first boss fight I used Dive for, which omega carried me through the more difficult situations I found myself in. This isn't to say Lostkin has no tricks up its sleeve though. If you're too close when it recovers from being staggered, its hitbox shifts forward really quickly, which caught me off guard during multiple heal. It can also do this. All 3 of these fights are excellent in their own regard, but if you held a meteor over my head and told me to rank them, I'd say they probably go something like this. The next category of bosses is named Dance for self-explanatory reasons. These fights are some of the fastest and most dynamic in the game. The bosses all adhere to a keep up or die trying principle, and will most likely make you look like a pathetic flailing baby the first few times you fight them. That is, until you reach that critical breaking point, where you start to move in lockstep with the boss, it presenting you a cue and you responding with a pre-orchestrated response, thus forming what feels like a dance. Sly is an excellent, albeit unorthodox example of what I mean here. Sly's ludicrously fast, and has a nail approximately 5 knights in length, which he somehow manages to not only wield, but swing at terrifying speeds. But he has one fatal weakness: end lag. This fight is based on your ability to whiff punish Sly after he's done throwing his nail's weight around. Unless you're literally a god, you're probably not going to be able to react to Sly's attacks in time to fight him up close, so you have to abuse this end lag to win. But it's not always obvious where this end lag is. For example, he has this plunging attack which seems like it would take a while to recover from, but he immediately does this gigantic upward arc with his nail, covering every angle of attack. It's only after this upward slice that you can safely go in and hit him. Sly also has access to the 3 nail arts, and just like they are in the Knight's kit, they're pretty much all gimmicks. The only one of any importance is Great Slash, due to its speed and punishing 2 masks of damage for getting hit. Most of the time, you get into a rhythm of baiting Sly into doing an attack, waiting for him to finish, and then getting your few hits in while you can. Phase 2 just accentuates this further, boiling the fight down to its fundamental principle. Sly only has 1 attack, but the window of opportunity to hit him is very small. Master the timing, and you'll be in a rhythmic dance in no time. This fight is a really cool exploration of whiff punishing, and no other boss does it quite like Sly. Okay, I've put it off for long enough. I have to talk about Sisters of Battle. This fight very well might be the best in the whole game, and if Sly were a nice slow dance, then Sisters of Battle is like Melee on crack. You can practically hear the controller clacks. It even has that incredible moment in the Pantheon of Hallownest, where you're fighting Mantis Lords normally, not expecting anything special to happen, and then the phase transitions and the 3rd Mantis stands back up. The fight absolutely lives up to the hype as well. It's an adrenaline-filled, think-fast throwdown where you're relying on pure instincts to prevail. So how do the Sisters of Battle form such an incredible fight when they don't even get any new moves compared to the normal Mantis Lords fight? Well, I think it has to do with the way they overlap their attack cues. Think about it, no one's going to describe the base Mantis Lords fight as being faster than, like, Failed Champion, but equally tossing one additional Mantis into the mix makes Sisters of Battle undeniably one of, if not the fastest fights in Hollow Knight. And yeah, obviously there's 3 Mantis Lords and 1 Failed Champ. But it's how the Mantis Lords maneuver around each other that gives the fight its electric pace. Due to the overlapping of cues, you can see one Mantis Lord prepare an attack, figure out how you're going to dodge it, and before that execution even takes place, the other 2 are already preparing their attacks, and now you have to dodge those too, and from a more compromised position. And this cycle never ends. They give you absolutely no breathing room whatsoever, at least until you defeat one of the lords. It's the only fight in the game where I feel like Quick Slash is still too slow. The only thing I could possibly think to make this frenetic duel any more fantastic is if the sisters shared their health pool, so you never get that awkward phase towards the end of the bout where it just becomes a normal Mantis Lords fight. The next fight we're going to be talking about is Nightmare King Grim, but before that I want to touch on the lead up to that fight. The Grim Troop just appearing in Dirtmouth was very intriguing to me the first time I saw it. I only barely remembered why it was even there since I took so long to get back to Dirtmouth after activating it. As for its implementation into the game, since it is DLC, I'm kinda mixed, only because I think it should be easier to access. I went my entire first playthrough without finding the damn thing. The quest it gives you is conceptually sound, especially for people coming back to the game when the DLC first dropped. You get to travel around Hallownest again to collect the flames for the Grimchild. The issue is, I'm playing from a save where I just went and explored all of Hallownest, so to be honest, it feels more like a fetch quest than a walk through memory lane. The reward though is absolutely worth it. NKG is one of 3 bosses to get a full title, and it's wholly deserved. He has 5 main attacks and 1 phase transition attack, all of which demand absolute perfection in terms of responses. That's a good thing, because 4 isn't a lot, so requiring such tight reactions isn't unreasonable. And there's the Floor Spikes attack that lets you heal, but also requires some quick thinking in order to safely do so. Attempting to heal here also elicits potentially different responses, specifically to the 2 stab attacks, where if you're slow, you have to Shade Cloak through them, as jumping is no longer fast enough. I originally thought that there would be very little room for the development of an offensive strategy in this fight due to the nature of NKG's patterns. Sure, he teleports away pretty quickly out of most attacks, but that doesn't mean you can't squeeze in an extra hit or 2 if you're willing to take a riskier dodging pattern. Honestly, the fight felt like less of a struggle for survival and more like executing a pre-planned strategy. And coming up with that strategy was my favourite part of the fight, especially when some of the things I hypothesized actually worked. Let's be real, I got smokes in like 10 seconds the first 5 times I attempted this fight, but learning the correct responses to NKG's attacks made those 10 seconds turn into 10 minutes real quick. My favourite realisation was that I was actually being too much of a coward on his grounded lunge attack. I was trying and failing to jump backwards, dash backwards, whatever, and it wasn't working at all. So I realised I had to jump forwards, parry his initial slash, and get my damage in on his jump up. It felt really good for offense to be the answer to this fight, which I had previously thought to be too defensively focused. NKG's most deadly attack, in my opinion, is the downwards drill lunge, and it's almost entirely because of the weird hitbox shifting. It's a surprisingly tight window on when you can actually pogo him while he's leaned down, to the point where once I successfully pogoed him just to get hit when he stood back up to lunge. The miasma he leaves behind is a cool way to punish you for whiffing the pogo too. The best part about this fight to me is the telegraphs and their subtle differences. You can tell what attack NKG is about to do based almost entirely off of his distance from you. I haven't seen another boss do this quite as outstandingly as NKG, and it's a really neat way of getting around needing a significant amount of visual reaction time before an attack comes out to make it seem fair. This affords the fight a much quicker pace, which is part of why it's so good. If he's close and grounded, he'll lunge. Far and grounded, he'll do the bats. Far and aerial, and you'll get the flame pillars. If he's close and aerial, he'll do the drill attack. And if he's nowhere, then he'll do the spikes. Attention on that last one because that's a really neat way of telegraphing an attack. Also, the heart in the background changes visually about halfway through the fight, which is very epic. Also, the heart in the background plays a heartbeat sound which makes me very shook, and is not very epic. Hey, remember when I said most of the fights in Hollow Knight were designed? Well, I want to give a shout out to the ones that weren't. This is the disappointment category, and what better way to get started than with Fluke Marm? Not only is this ugly creature legitimately disgusting, but it's also so easy it might as well be considered an inanimate object. And considering the other contenders in that category include Spikes and Acid, it can't even claim to be the best inanimate object either. Best put it out of its misery. 1 millimeter tall step above that disaster is Umu, a boss with attacks so inconsequential that I genuinely got lost in my own movement and forgot I was supposed to be fighting. Imagine being the only thing in the game with literal invincibility and losing to Quirrell of all people. Embarrassing. Godhome made the fight 1% more interactive, but at least Umu fits the area theme of being annoying to fight, a compliment I cannot extend to Nosk. This thing is so pathetically easy that it puts the legitimacy of Deep Nest's terror at question through sheer incompetence alone. I can't believe the incredible sequence leading up to Nosk, being baited by a bug copying the knight's likeness, was so thoroughly squandered by making the fight equivalent to a goddamn Mario Party minigame. Oh, and let's not forget Nosk's second form, Winged Nosk. This thing is the figurehead of a category I like to call the normal enemy bosses. I understand that this is now, what, a subcategory of a subcategory of a subcategory of a subcategory? But I feel like this subcategory perfectly encapsulates just how insignificant Winged Nosk is. It's a glorified Vengefly King, except its hitbox is even larger and easier to double hit with Fireball. Speaking of Vengefly King, you'd think it's pretty powerful given the fact that it seemed to best the almighty Zote. But let's be honest, Zote could have one-shot that thing in a heartbeat if he weren't testing the knight's meager strength. This guy's a test of if your keyboard has a jump button, nothing more. Following along, Traitor Lord is actually just a big Mantis traitor, and it's not even trying to hide it. If Vengefly King is a jump button test, then Traitor Lord is a test of if you can do the hand-braking task of not only jumping, but also holding backwards. It technically has 2 other moves, but it won't even get the opportunity to use them if you just stay close. And why would you run away from such a pitiful excuse for a boss? Next up, back in the disappointment category now, is No Eyes. Admittedly, this fight is actually kinda good in the Godhome arena. She just has such a laughably small health pool that she died in like 10 seconds flat, because apparently Dream Warrior health is based on nail upgrades. The only other boss I could reasonably call a disappointment is the Radiance. Wait, what? Surely this is a joke, I hear you cry, and, yeah, the whole section's kind of a joke. I really do have some issues with the Radiance though, but in order to substantiate said qualms, we first have to talk about what comes before it. The Black Egg Temple is home to the Hollow Knight, who is in turn home to the Radiance, which is going to be the end of the game for most players. Because let's face it, the Pantheon of Hallownest is not for everyone. Quick anecdote, but when I got to the Black Egg Temple and got World Sense, my completion percentage was at 68%, which obviously wasn't satisfactory, but luckily Sly hooked me up with a mask shard to complete the funny number. Also, why is this egg so damn big? Anyway, the atmosphere in here is incredible. There's a palpable sense of foreboding waiting for you beyond the bench. It's the grand finale, and it feels just as special as the rest of the game leading up to that point. Confronting the Hollow Knight is something you must do on your own terms. You opt into this path through the action of breaking the chains restraining it. This is echoed in the Radiance fight, where you must directly challenge her, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Hollow Knight is quite an easy fight. I mean, it literally starts stabbing itself halfway through. This is an ingenious way to showcase the battle for control over the Hollow Knight's mind through gameplay, or rather, the Hollow Knight's commitment to stopping the Radiance in any way it can. Quite the heroic sacrifice for an entity the Pale King considered to be entirely hollow of emotion, thought, or really anything. To me, Hollow Knight serves as a story fight, and isn't supposed to be challenging. It shouldn't have to be either. It makes sense from a plot perspective, and even a gameplay one considering you're going to have to battle through it to get another crack at the Radiance each time you die. Taking a look at the fight itself, it's honestly one of my favourites. It's kinda like a big Lostkin, which obviously makes sense thematically. It being easy is an unfortunate restriction because of the Radiance's existence, but even looking past that, Hollow Knight's moveset is packed with fun, fast attacks. The construction of said moveset being built from both nail strikes and infection attacks certainly makes this fight a memorable one. Hollow Knight mixes up between 2 different forward stabs, which each require subtly distinct responses which keeps you on your toes. For example, if you choose to pogo, you're going to have to make sure you time it a tad later for the triple slash, as the boss leans down quite considerably while performing it. Counter deserves special attention, I think. It's designed really beautifully around Shade Cloak in particular. I found the 2 main ways of dodging it after triggering it were to either dash through him or time a dash back with his swing. The existence of this counterplay allows for you to actually take advantage of Hollow Knight countering, and get some some damage in, rather than just sitting there until he's done as you would normally. You can even do the dash through strategy when he's cornered because of the large step forward he takes. The only other noteworthy attack is the spewing attack. It just feels really satisfying to shimmy back and forth to dodge. The main critique I can give to the Hollow Knight, and this applies to the Radiants too actually, is that you guys need to get a little more creative with your move choice. Eventually Soul Tyrant's gonna realize you're ripping off his diving attack or his homing light spheres, and he's not gonna be happy when he does. Now, onto the Radiants. I have two good things to say about this boss. The first is that the atmosphere is amazing. I already said that you have to challenge the Radiants to initiate the fight, but you don't really know what you're challenging until the goddamn sun starts moving. That's incredible. The second thing is that, no joke, the small gaps in the vertical swords are some of the best game design I've ever seen. Okay, maybe that's a bit of hyperbole in there, but I feel really strongly about giving the player such a skill-based option, even for such minimal reward. It just feels immaculate. And that's it. Those are the good parts of the Radiance. Now, onto why this fight is so disappointing for me. Radiance is part of a very small club of bosses which just kind of exist on your screen, stay mostly stationary, and eat damage. This club includes the likes of Flukmarm and Umu, so it's already not a great start. Yes, the Radiants can teleport, but be honest with yourself, that's a lot less dynamic than actually moving. Soul Tyrant already did this gimmick better, and his body has a hitbox to be actually threatening with for the few attacks he does move for. Radiance does 2 masks of damage with its swords if they ever manage to hit you. The homing light spheres are the only measurable threat in the fight, to be honest, other than maybe getting unlucky with 2 moving pillars of light spawning one after the other, while you don't have enough soul to dive through the second one. But when are you ever going to have a lack of soul when Radiance is sitting there being a glorified sandbag? I will at least reiterate that the vertical swords giving you a cool way to dodge them is good, but that's really the whole fight. There are 3 distinct phases, the first taking place in the original platform, the second getting a new platform layout, and the third being the ascent. Phase 2 arguably makes the fight easier, as Radiance doesn't even get a new pattern, while the new platform layout only serves to give the player more space. Come on, even Failed Champ got a new pattern on Phase 2. Phase 3 is barely a phase at all. Just climb without getting hit by the incredibly telegraphed beams of light. Radiance just sits there and lets you hit it for the majority of the fight without putting up much resistance. Like, this thing is what's infecting Hallownest? Gerb would eviscerate this thing in a 1v1. I hope Menderbug's finished fixing his mirror, poor guy. As for why it's bad for the Radiance to be this easy while I give Hollow Knight a pass, well, it's the final fight. I shouldn't have to explain why a final boss is supposed to be at least a little challenging. Without that, there's no stakes, no hype, no excitement when you finally clench victory. It's fine for a game to have a relatively easy final boss too, as long as it's consistent with the rest of the game, but it's not. The Dream Refights took me a long time. Failed Champ alone probably took me upwards of 50 tries, but here I am, hitlessing Radiance on my first try with a base nail. That's pretty bad. You could argue that maybe I'm abusing upgraded spells here, which I didn't have for some other bosses, but even so, if the parameters for making the final boss challenging is base nail, no spell upgrades, no charms, then there's still a fundamental problem. I wish this fight was better, but trust me, there is a happy ending to this story. I've mentioned it a few times already, but the Black Egg Temple is not the only place to house an ending. Godhome does as well, and along with the secondary finale, it brings upgraded versions of both Hollow Knight and Radiance. Godhome is a boss rush mode, with a few new bosses thrown in to keep things fresh, and at the very peak of Godhome lies the Pantheon of Hallownest, a non-stop gauntlet of every single boss in the game. And Soul Warrior. My quick thoughts about the place? It's okay. There's an overarching ideal here that basically overrides all the criticism I'm about to give, which goes something like, it's the Pantheon, the final boss rush, nothing should be left out, and any absences would take away from the prestige. That being said, I think Pantheon of Hallownest could have been handled differently and kept this prestige, because as it is right now, it takes about 45 minutes to go from beginning to end. The most noticeable thing about Pantheon of Hallownest is that both normal and Dream boss variants appear, which is quite redundant. If you can beat the Dream version, you can beat the normal one. So cutting the base versions and only including the Dream counterparts would save the player a lot of time for basically no cost to prestige. There's also a few fringe cases like Vengefly King and Oblobbles which don't really scream boss at me, but I understand that cutting them would be a slippery slope. Taking into account that you just beat every other Pantheon to unlock this one, this repetition gets quite dull. At least a lot of the early bosses have new arenas to spice things up, like Gru's Mother, who unironically hit me more times than Pure Vessel did right after I was practicing it in the Hall of Gods. What I would have loved for the Pantheon of Hallownest is if it functioned more like the true arena from Kirby, basically stuffing 10ish of the hardest bosses in the game into one gauntlet, with the other Pantheons serving as the normal arena equivalent. It even has the final 3 full title card bosses at the end: NKG, Pure Vessel, and Absolute Radiance's Soul, or whatever it's called. Pure Vessel is my favourite fight in the game. I love this boss. It's everything I wanted out of a Dream variant for Hollow Knight. It's just a bit faster, more punishing, but still fair, and it has interesting new moves. The Stomach Knives one is definitely based on a much slower attack Hollow Knight had with the same properties, but because Pure Vessel is pure, all the infection attacks are replaced with something else, which is so chill. The Slam attack and Bullet Hell attack are both gone, replaced with 2 new attacks. One is a soul attack that hits in a large circle and causes area hazards to spawn shortly after, and the other is a very slow long-range Shade Whip. It's obviously also really nice to see Pure Vessel use its Void characteristics to attack, which it only starts doing at about half health, so it can be read as somewhat of a desperation maneuver. Its Grounded Spikes attack is an interesting case. It feels even faster than NKG's version of the same thing, but Pure Vessel can still be hit during it if you space yourself correctly. This swiftness comes with the trade-off that Pure Vessel will always strike the ground before the spikes spawn, effectively letting you know to be ready to react. You have to react to being ready to react. I'm not sure what exactly makes this fight so fun to move around in, all I know is that it's true. I think this is simply the most mechanically excellent fight in the game. I actually cannot fathom a single flaw with it. Every attack Pure Vessel does has a purpose, and you get given no quarter, let alone any freebies, when looking for openings. It's a feverish fight fraught with frenetic frenzy. Victory must not only be earned, but wrenched from the jaws of defeat. It's the epitome of perfection in a game most people already consider to be near perfect. If that doesn't accurately convey how damn good this fight is to you, I don't think anything could. Absolute Radiance is such a gigantic step up from the Radiance that it's difficult to put into words just how much better it is. Unfortunately, Pure Vessel exists, so I can't say it's my absolute favourite fight, but it's damn close. The only other fights that are even in the same ballpark as this are NKG's Sisters of Battle and somewhat strangely Lost Kin. Please don't ask me to elaborate on that last one. Absolute Radiance feels 2 times faster than its base form, and weaving through vertical swords has never felt better. Phase 1's overlaying of attacks not only makes things incredibly difficult, but also creates so many different situations which you have to be prepared for. Absolute Radiance only has about 6 attacks, but because of this layering, mostly with the vertical and horizontal swords, there ends up being so much complexity. This is not how the base Radiance's moves should have been. This is obviously way too hard to be anything but a challenge boss. But this is still excellent as a challenge boss. They've utilized the Radiance's base moves exceedingly effectively here. I do believe there's a middle ground here that would have suited base Radiance better, but as for my disappointment at the normal Radiance, this fight more than makes up for it. By far the second hardest fight in the game. The phase transition between 1 and 2 is a nice breather, not only letting you rack up soul, but then letting you actually use it to heal up on the stagger. Phase 2 really shows how much an arena can change a fight. Absolute Radiance has the exact same moves, but the platforms and wider area make everything from hitting it to dodging its attacks so much harder. A lot of this has to do with 2 main things. Radiance is off-screen quite frequently, making her already blazing fast attacks even more challenging to react to, and her light spheres can no longer consistently be grounded and neutralized. In fact, they can't be grounded at all for the first second or so after they spawn, but it's extra tough here because they can straight up phase through platforms. This was not the case in the normal Radiance fight. Everything she could throw at you was simply too slow to provide any real issue, whereas here, it really feels like a fight for survival just to dodge everything, let alone chase Absolute Radiance down in order to actually do damage. The Ascent is significantly less forgiving, and is better off for it. It serves as a final, let's let this really sink in, section to what is most likely about an hour-long ordeal. The pressure should be getting to you. I know it got to me way more than I thought it would, so I can personally testify that this segment was a resounding success. Phase 3 is the easiest phase by far, but it's just execution heavy enough to the point where your spaghetti fingers will make things more interesting than you probably want them to be. This isn't even a phase in the base Radiance fight, but it doesn't outstay its welcome either, its health being quite low. It's an epic final standoff, just you, the Radiance, and the real boss, the glowing homing light spheres. Let me leave you with 4 indisputable facts. Absolute Radiance is an amazing fight. Hollow Knight is an amazing game. I don't know how to end videos, and I want to throw Markov into a blender, throw the blender into a wood chipper, then send the wood chipper into the sun, and then maybe Markov will have experienced as much pain as he so effortlessly dealt out to me. Thank you for watching.